Hello and welcome to another Times Members Question and Answer. Today we're answering comments and questions from our channel members on Frontline and other videos about current conflicts around the world. I'm Philip Ingram. I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and now global commentator on all matters geopolitics, defence, security and other things. And we've got a number of good questions today. Our first question comes from Deborah. I was hoping there'd be something on Donald Trump. She asks, is anyone going to mention the Panama issue because of Trump's hotel tax evasion charges? He doesn't want to pay the taxes and wants revenge on his enemies. I think she's suggesting that when Donald Trump said as part of his inauguration speech that America was going to take the Panama Canal back, she's referring to that. Now, Donald Trump, there are issues with some of the business deals that he's going on in Canada, as in Panama. Taxes are coming in. He's in dispute with the authorities that are in there, but he is with his businesses in many countries around the world. But I think from a presidential perspective, actually what he's looking at with regard to his threats against Panama, and they were threats, is more related to the control of the Panama Canal, which of course the United States built. They bought it from the French who were building it. It was American or American employed lives that were sacrificed in the building of it. America owned it for quite a period of time before then handing it across to the Panamanian government, and they wanted it under Panamanian government control. There's a port at either end of it. Those are controlled by Hong Kong registered companies, so have got links to China, and there's an increasing Chinese influence in the Panama Canal. But also, if you look at it from a wider perspective, there's an increasing Chinese influence across the whole of South America and coming up into Central America, which is worrying Donald Trump. He's concerned that whenever America owned the Panama Canal, there were no tariffs for US ships that were going through, especially warships and others. Now the US is probably the nation that's providing most maritime traffic going through the Panama Canal, and is paying the same rates as every other ship that goes through, but that, because it's providing most traffic, is more significant for US trade than trade from other countries. And therefore I think what he wants to do is put pressure on Panama to reduce the amount that US shipping is having to pay and make a special case, and to send a warning shot across the bow to China about increased Chinese control into Central America, and therefore I would suspect further into South America. So I think there's a lot more to play out with regard to Panama, and yes, Donald Trump's wider business deals will have an impact on not just what's going on in Panama, but I suspect a number of other policies that come out around the world. He, as POTUS now, as the President of the United States, will keep his business deals as separate as he possibly can, because I don't think he wants another round of court appearances once he's finished being the 47th President of the United States. Cecil comes in with the next question, and this goes back to Ukraine, and says, surely Germany's inconsistent stance on Ukraine, along with compromised Hungary and Slovakia, has been hugely damaging for Europe, especially for Ukraine. Well, yes, it's been hugely damaging for Ukraine, and Hungary and Slovakia, with their almost pro-Putin stance, is making a bit of a mockery of the EU, because they have a veto in the EU, and that is holding up an awful lot of the wider European support, and the way the EU comes together to deal with a common threat. Germany, as probably the largest economy in the EU and the largest contributor to the EU budget, because of their coalition government style that's there, and because of Chancellor Scholz's reluctance to effectively collapse his government in making hard decisions with regard to support to Ukraine, and the inconsistencies that we've seen that have caused him real difficulties between him and his defence minister and other ministers. Well, I think that's what's led to the collapse of the coalition in Germany, and we are seeing next month German elections. So what's going to come out of those elections, we don't know. If it's the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland party, more far right, they are more anti-Ukraine, and it's Ukraine that's suffering with all of this. However, I think there's going to be a Trump effect that comes in, because President Trump will want Europe to step up and take greater responsibility for supporting Ukraine. And I can see some bullying tactics coming out of Washington aimed at the EU, aimed at other European countries, including the UK, and aimed at other NATO members, i.e. Canada, to step up and take greater responsibility for providing support into Ukraine. So yes, Ukraine has been suffering because of inconsistencies in Germany's approach, and the same with Hungary and Slovakia. I think the EU has been embarrassed, and I think it's actually damaged the EU as well. Steve comes in and says, I suspect that Europe will get its show together and develop an arms industry divorced from the US. Charles de Gaulle was right. Don't count on the Americans. I would like to agree with you, Steve, if Europe actually could talk as one voice. And that's what the EU was all about, Europe talking with one voice. But when it comes to defence and therefore the defence industrial base is still a national issue. And with Charles de Gaulle, he was 100% right. The Americans will never come to the defence of the French, which is why France has kept its independent nuclear deterrent. But French Minister of Defence, French defence industrial base will never go and not compete for projects because a German company is competing, or a Dutch company, or another company from within the EU is doing it. So in defence, there's still that very nationalistic approach to things. Europe is a long, long way off getting its defence show together. And the US will still outcompete Europe by a long way. The UK used to be Europe's biggest defence contributor until the UK left Europe and left Brexit. But I can see an awful lot more pressure coming from the United States to try and force the EU to take a more collective approach, especially when it comes to the defence support into Ukraine. But we have to wait and see what Donald Trump does. Whether that will cause greater scepticism in France, Charles de Gaulle right. France is under some political difficulties at the moment with its government having collapsed, but not able to hold new general elections for at least another, I think it's 8 or 9 months, because they need 12 months in between elections. So another interim minority government is being put into place. And of course, we need to see what the new German government looks like. Those will set the standards that there are across Europe and Europe's drive. The Scandinavian countries are embarrassing some of Europe's traditional members, but again, we'll have to see what that impact is. We live in interesting times, I think. Andrew comes in with a slightly longer comment, and he says, I don't think Putin sees the war in primarily military terms. I think he's still pragmatic, but has almost a religious view of this conflict, so that every field taken at enormous cost isn't a military failure. It's another small step in his mission to save Ukraine and the Ukrainians from being Ukrainian. Yes, I don't think he'll negotiate with Trump in the next few months at all, as this would make him look weak. And because of, in his terms, he currently thinks he's winning. I doubt if his advisors give him an accurate assessment of the military position. The Russian army has found a way to almost use untrained troops to take territory. And as long as supply equals casualties, he'll be able to keep on fighting. When Putin does negotiate, it will be because he's run out of the road in societal, economic and military terms, and he has no options left. Andrew, I think you're right, actually, in many ways. Too many commentators look at what's going on in the conflict in Ukraine and look at the tactical battle and who's winning on the front lines in the east of Ukraine. And Russia is advancing very slowly at, as you say, huge cost. Is Putin worried about the manpower? No. He's got an eye on it because he can't get enough Russians to come and join the military, and he's reluctant to bring in any form of conscription into Moscow, St. Petersburg and elsewhere, because that will bring the conflict into much more of the public domain, which is why he's looking at North Korea, Africa. He's just signed an international agreement with Iran for military materiel support, but also manpower support, as we've seen coming in from North Korea. The war is going to be won or lost, I think, at the operational level and the strategic level. And that will require Putin to negotiate with Zelensky and to listen to Trump. Clearly, the messaging that he's been sending back to Donald Trump has not resonated well, which is why Donald Trump is threatening him with economic sanctions. The one thing, and I saw this on an interview with Bill Browder the great commentator on Putin, and someone who actually understands the Russian psyche, he says the one thing that will break Putin is economics. And when he realizes he can't continue to afford the war, and that's afford from a money perspective and a business perspective, not a manpower perspective, because he doesn't care. He doesn't care how many casualties that are there. You're right. I don't think he's been briefed the ground truth. People around him, like around any dictator at his sort of level, will tell him roughly what they think he wants to hear rather than the reality that's on the ground. Maybe Donald Trump will feed him more of the reality whenever the two of them talk, if they actually get down to talking. I can see us moving in a position where Donald Trump will provide further support to Ukraine. And I think Putin, unless he can come away with something that suggests he has won and he has got his territory back, and I think from Putin's perspective, that's the whole of the Donbass and Crimea. He may settle for Crimea with the land bridge through part of the Donbass to make sure that that's part of Mother Russia. He may be able to settle for that, but that's what Putin will want. He'll want to see some form of success. Is that acceptable for Zelensky? Not in the long term. In the short term, he said he could live with that and then negotiate something diplomatically. So we live in interesting times once again. And AJ comes in and says, did Times Radio ever mention that Ukrainians are the second biggest nationality inside Russia? At least 15 million of them who highly disagree with the Zelensky administration and with the Western policies. A true fact. Well, yes, AJ, Ukraine is a huge territory, and Ukraine and Russia during Soviet times have been so close. Putin described the Ukrainians as little Russians. He did that for two reasons. He doesn't see the difference between European Russians and European Ukrainians. He almost sees them as one race, but he actually sees the Ukrainian version as a lower standard race, which is why he referred to them as little Russians. It was a demeaning comment, as well as it was you're part of our wider nation. So he doesn't believe that Ukraine should exist as a separate country. A large number of ethnic Ukrainians have married ethnic Russians. Their families, as you've identified, are all across Russia and everything else. And I know Ukrainian families, having talked to them, they've split completely, where some that are based in Ukraine support Zelensky, understand what the Russians have done, and members of the same family who are based in Russia are getting their news from the Russian outlets, and they believe Putin. And you get that separation that's there. The level of control that Putin has got over the information narrative that's getting out is phenomenal. And I talk to individuals who should know and do have access to world news and should know what's going on inside Russia from time to time. And they are very reluctant to say anything against Putin. And their immediate approach, if you ask them what they thought, would be to support Putin. They don't believe the Western narrative because they believe Putin's stance that the West is spinning things and this is a wider war of Russian national survival against NATO. So, yeah, you're right. But you're right with people who are being fed disinformation and are living in an environment where they cannot have freedom of thought. Those that know Zelensky, and in Ukraine, you have to remember that when Zelensky first came in, he wasn't a popular president. He was pushing corruption out. He was changing the political stance in many ways, and that upset a lot of Ukrainians. It was only whenever Russia reinvaded 3 years ago that Zelensky's popularity then grew enormously, because he turned around and, having been offered the opportunity to run away, he stayed. And I think that's what changed things. Those Ukrainians inside Russia don't see that from a nationalistic perspective. So those are the questions today. Thanks for watching this week's question and answer and for posting your questions. Put more questions underneath if you've got anything relating to what I've said. Sign up for exclusive videos and have your questions answered, getting a Times Radio membership. Then you can put your questions and your comments in there, and we'll endeavour to answer those next week or in the coming weeks. But thank you for watching this week. Goodbye.